Hello, everybody. This is Derek Taylor for HIST 140, U.S. History to 1877. This is my little mini lecture introduction to the readings for this week, Module 7 and 8, Hammering out a Federal Republic and Creating a Republican Culture. Just going to go over the readings fairly briefly. Last set of readings and modules had to do with the American Revolution and the creation of the new Constitution as a new nation is forming, because that's kind of the thing that happens in this period, is that the sort of development of the colonies as individual colonies got disrupted by the war, and you have under the pressure of the creation of something like a nation, but it's not really a fully formed thing. So people have the opportunity in the early republic to shape the institutions that are going to shape the country going forward. And this is what you get in chapter 7 and 8 in the textbook. Chapter 7 has to do mostly with, several things. Development of politics, the political crisis as the Constitution is implemented by the Federalists. This is one of the big things that happens, that you have the creation of parties, not quite like modern parties. They have party headquarters and stuff like that. But two big factions, Federalists and Republicans, who have different visions for the country. One represented by Alexander Hamilton, who wants to have a bigger, more invasive state. Wants to have a state because he thinks you need a powerful one in order to compete economically with other countries. He also wants to raise an army. One of the big things that drove the Federalists is they had problems. I mentioned this last time, getting the British, for example, to evacuate forts from the frontiers, because the United States didn't pay reparations like they were supposed to for the loyalists who were kicked out of the country after the war. And so they wanted a stronger military to deal with that. And so you have the Federalists on one side. On the other side, you have Republicans, and Thomas Jefferson's the sort of ideal type. He's their sort of leader in the early republic, and they'll talk about their different visions for the country. Hamilton's is more urban, more idea of a manufacturing society, a trading country. Jefferson is suspicious of all that. He's suspicious of cities. He doesn't like them. He thinks, like a lot of classical Republicans, that cities are a cesspool of vice, and that good virtue can be found in the countryside with small farmers. That's his, ironically, given who he is, a slave owner with a gigantic farm. Yeoman farmer, that's the term usually thrown about. The idea is that small farmers, because they're independent, because they grow their own crops, because they make their own living, and they're not dependent on other people, embody Republican virtue, which is they're independent enough to actually successfully carry out self-government. And so this is one of the things that he laws, and I'll show you in a second, in Major Problems. They give you some examples of this, writings from Jefferson and Hamilton. You also have in this chapter, and going through this, they'll talk about foreign policy. The French Revolution divides the country really bitterly because people like Jefferson support the revolution. The Federalists tend to be suspicious of the French. They're suspicious of too much liberty. And they tend to be more in favor of alliances with the British. So that'll be one of the things that forms these parties. The election of 1800, when John Adams, who succeeded, because he was the vice president of George Washington, is a knockdown, drag-out affair. In fact, it was worse than that. Some people thought there would be a revolution because they thought if Jefferson, if they weren't sure that there was enough national cohesion to actually transfer power peacefully. When they did, this is what sort of set the pattern. This is why Thomas Jefferson calls the election of 1800, called it the Revolution of 1800, because they managed to have, self-government in a republic where they can fight a lot, but they managed to obey the basic laws of the country. And so in came the Republicans in 1800. At the same time, you have the country expanding westward. United States, even before the revolution is over, they're pouring into the Western countries. They're pushing into Indian territory. Remember, this is one of the grievances they have with the British. They want to push west, and they begin carving out territory farther and farther west at the expense of the native peoples. People begin migrating west. This will have a huge impact on the country in the next few chapters. both economically speaking, but also politically speaking. Create new territories, new markets, new areas of agrarian production too, as well. So you have all these things going on at beginnings of founding of what the republic's going to be like. That's something they know they have to do. They don't have that many institutions. Does the new country? And in fact, as you're going to see, there's really an intertwining of domestic politics and foreign policy in the founding of the United States, because they're also deeply concerned about other countries. They're concerned about potential threats from European powers who might still be in the region. This is why they go to war with the British in 1812. One of the reasons they go to war with the British in 1812, which is a transformative event. I'll show you in a moment some essays on that, some stuff on this. But the early republic up to 1820 is a formative period for those reasons. Right, let me go through and I'll show you here. And show you, look at the readings for that section. This is readings for the module 7 on that are most of chapter 6, Nation Among Nations, Major Problems. They give you excerpts. You can kind of see it here. I'm scrolling through from a description of Comanches destroying Spanish missions in the 18th century. It's a reminder, partly they have it in there because of that, the Indians were there before, and the Comanche actually had their own empire basically in the Southwest. So there's already, there are already powers there before the United States, pushes west. Another source is a source from Thomas Jefferson, from his notes on Virginia, celebrating the virtues of small farmers, as I mentioned before. Oops, I'll show that there. And about the bottom, they also have, again, show you the impact of the ideas of the political revolution on private life, on ideas of equality in terms of between the sexes. Judith Sargent Murray, an early feminist from the early republic, or more or less early feminist from the early republic, arguing for the equality of sexes. Then they give you an excerpt from Alexander Hamilton outlining his vision for a modern economy, which is still crucial for us because we eventually followed his path and not Jefferson's, obviously. This is a cartoon from the XYZ affair, which is there's this scandal during the 1790s over French officials trying to bribe American commissioners. So this leads to a lot of, you'll get this in the textbook. You probably know this. Talleyrand is the French official involved in all this. And then 6 is Jefferson advancing the powers of the state. These are the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. When in response to some acts, the Alien and Sedition Acts that are passed by the Federalists, Adams and his Congress, which are kind of aimed at the Republican Party, they issue, Jefferson does, these declarations about states' rights, about how we don't have to put up with these federal laws because we have some power under the Constitution. So it's an argument for federalism to be very powerful on states' rights going forward, obviously. And then finally, you have the last one of these is John Marshall, who's the I don't think that's the last one there. I didn't sign all of these actually to you. Maybe I ended it there. I can't remember. But the first several or so of these, excuse me. Then starting on page 170, I give you the essay by David Wallstreicher, The Making American Nationalism. Again, basically talks about how people tried to make a nation in the early republic, how they had to basically invent a nation. It didn't. And sometimes historians, by the way, talk about modern nation states as being part of what are called invented traditions, like things that didn't exist, like in the before times, before the modern era. People's traditions went back before a time anybody could remember. But now, of course, you have an entire country being born in historical time. People were alive and they remember it. It's been written down. And so you would think that would get rid of traditions. It doesn't. You have these invented traditions, one of which is, the 4th of July celebrations. They come about, and you'll see this. I think they had mentioned this in some of your readings for this week, how these things became sites of conflict between the Federalists and the Republicans, trying to, duke it out, see whose interpretation of the revolution would win out. So you have all this efforts to create a country which wasn't really fully formed. It kind of sort of was. And in fact, a nation kind of has to be kind of formed almost unconsciously. Nobody can get up in the morning and say, you know what? My name is Derek Taylor. I'm going to go out today and found my own country. mean, you really can't. It takes building up over time, which is the outcome of all these other human interactions that you can't control that way. But even more, but they still can kind of sort of do it because the institutions are kind of already sort of there, but they've been transformed by the revolution, just as society has. And so that's what this chapter is going to cover there. Hold on for a second. Just go back. Promise I'm not screwing up too badly here. Oh, yes. So that's module 7 in that chapter. Next chapter is on creating a Republican culture. This is sort of the same time frame, but talking about how you create, again, a society whose habits had been, even in the colonies where there's no aristocracy, the king never come, he's never been to America. It's still a monarchical culture. People still drink toasts to the king up until the revolution. They still have statues of King George until the revolution. They pull them all down, or pull some of them down anyway in the colonies. You create habits that are Republican self-consciously. I'll give you one example of this. In the first couple of administrations, in Washington's administration, when they received people at the White House, visitors, Washington would give them a bow, because this is the kind of thing you did at royal courts in Europe, right? It was sort of a standard thing. Aristocrats did this sort of thing. The person who changed this was Thomas Jefferson. When people came to the White House, instead of doing that, he wanted to do something democratic. What did he do? He shook their hand. Again, equality, right? This is what I mean by habits. That's what a culture is, like the habits of a people in many respects. And this is what's going on in the early part of the Republic. And that's what your chapter in the textbook will talk about the creation of of a new economy, especially at a state level. Again, a lot of things went on at states level in the early republic because, again, we didn't have that much of a central government. And so a lot of it was done through what they called the public enterprise system, the Commonwealth system, where state governments would fund and give, grants and stuff to companies to build up, things like public works projects, canals and stuff like that. But there's also a reshaping of life. Your textbook spends some time talking about Republican families. What is that, a Republican family? Again, you've never known anything but life in a democratic republic. But back then, again, you have, aristocracy is still the basic model of society in Europe. And even before the revolution, this was mentioned at the Constitutional Convention, the colonies had very different, for example, laws about inheritance, right? It's a real crucial difference that in aristocratic countries, because you want to keep your wealth together and pass it on, that the majority of or most of it goes to the eldest son. That's called primogeniture. Whereas in the colonies, they never had that. They had what's called partible inheritance, which is to say almost all people in the colonies divided their wealth to all their children, which makes for more economic and legal equality. Relatively more, not total. We don't have total now. Nobody ever does. There's no such thing as total equality, by the way. You should not get that into your head. But relatively speaking, this is a huge change, right? So it means that family life changes inevitably, right? People, they're treated more equally, just as kids, just how they're treated by their parents. They'll talk about some more of this other stuff that happens in the book as well. And people begin to reflect on this, right? They ask about, okay, well, how do we raise children in a Republican society? We're supposed to be all equal. That's the classical Republican ideal they've inherited. And self-reliant and independent, right? There's all this talk about this stuff. And there are major debates about this. There's also, of course, debates about slavery, because that's the other huge challenge, of course, that holdover from the pre-modern era. We just had a revolution about equality and self-government. How does that happen? Well, of course, it begins to, there are debates about this in the South and the North. Of course, in the North, as you're going to see, we'll get to this next week, you had the coming of industry first there. And that will provide a big incentive for there's still slavery in the North, in the early part of the Republic, but it's never as extensive. And eventually what's going to happen is it's going to push it in a direction where it gets rid of that. And by the way, there's not only still slavery in the early Republic in the North, I want to say until the 1830s, there's still indentured servitude in the early Republic. So this is something to keep in mind. I say this because, again, you don't think of these things as extending into the Republican period, but they do. So all these things, of course, you begin to see regional differences becoming more and more important in the North and South. this is what your textbook will go over, talk about some of this stuff as well. As well as some other aspects of religion, which I have a whole section on that. We'll go over that later. I will go over briefly. I think I gave you two things from the readings. One essay from Major Problems, which I'll talk about. I'll spend the rest of the time talking about Joyce Appleby's book, which I gave you excerpts of. Hold on one second. And get back to, here. So the other reading for that module 8, should be module 8, right? Module 8 would be from chapter 7. And this will be, I believe, essays. Oh, no, actually, that's the wrong one. Excuse me. This will be actually, hold on for one moment. I screwed things up royally, didn't I? Is it, maybe it's this one. No. I did screw up royally. It's back here. It is in chapter 6, isn't it? No. I'm wrong. It is in chapter 7. Sorry, that was it. I was right. I knew exactly what I was talking about. And it's 196 to 203, which is the War of 1812 as a borderland war. It's from a book by excerpt from the book by Alan Taylor. And it's about the War of 1812 as something that forms national identity in the early republic. His idea and his basic thesis is that the war between the British and the Americans was as much about proving to the rest of the world this was a stable republic, and that they were no longer subjects of the British. Because what happens, partly the cause of the war, is the British are seizing American sailors from American merchant ships to go serve in the war, the Napoleonic Wars, the war against Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe, on the pretext that they'd been born originally, a lot of them, as members of the British Empire, as subjects of the British crown. And so this is an ideological war, but it's also, as he says, it's a borderland not just physically, because of course the British Empire is still very present in the early republic. It's in Canada. It's right across the border from the north, from New England. But it's also conceptually a border between what's a subject and what's a citizen in a republic. So it's an interesting little essay there. But the biggest reading I gave you, I need to explain why I gave you this because it is a little long, but I wanted to give it to you because it's a good book. And I give you the first and last chapters of Inheriting the Revolution by Joyce Appleby. Who's an historian. I think she's long since retired. For many years at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And I give you the preface, which you don't need to take a look at, but the table of contents. You should always, by the way, look at the table of contents to a book, and just to get an idea what's in it before you read it, just so you know where you want to skim, because you have to skim in college and definitely in graduate school if you ever go there, because you're reading so much, science so much. But I also give you a few of the illustrations in the book. That's why it says 64 pages in the PDF file. It's only about 55 pages of actual reading. And in this, all she's trying to do is she's going through all these various types of, writings and images, letters, novels, newspapers, journals, diaries and stuff like that. But all these other sources to look at how the first generations of Americans were born as Americans, born after the Revolution, sort of shaped the country. What ideas did they have? And again, that's as much of a thesis I think she gives. But I think she wants to emphasize how much agency they had, how much they shaped things, even though she's aware that they don't really come to a conclusion. She comes to the same, at the end of the concluding chapter, most people do, that there's not really one. Well, there is one notion of the nation, but it's kind of a northern notion because it wins out later on. But in fact, what's happening is you're having rival notions of what the nation is develop along sectional lines. But it's an interesting book because she tells, because she gives you all this information of individuals who were alive at the time and what they thought they were doing. And again, just how much opportunity there was in all this. Because again, you have to remember, this is what makes the United States, what made it totally unique then, and was it's not unique anymore because it's spread its sort of social structure to the rest of the world, tried to, is that the revolution basically before the modern revolutions, the modern age, most people in like European societies tended to think of social order as something unchanging, static, eternal, right? There's an order. There are aristocrats, there are peasants, there are people on top. It's always the same people on top, always going to be people on the bottom. And what happens is with all the changes of the modern era, and not just the revolution, but other things, of course, that all goes away. And that has a profound effect, of course, because now instead of believing, again, if you're a peasant in medieval Europe, like you don't, there was a traveler, I can't remember the guy's name, I think it's the Duc is a French aristocrat, not Alexis de Tocqueville, that's later, but in the 1790s, came to America, and he asked American farmers if they had the same sort of attachments to the land, to their local, to the local village they grew up in, as peasants do in Europe. And all the farmers told him no. They're like, they thought that exhibited a lack of pluck, a lack of energy. And the thing that always gets every visitor to the early United States when they come from Europe is just how manic life seems. People are constantly on the move, immigrating west, building something, doing this, knowing that, constructing this, because in a society where now it's no longer you're eternally at the bottom of society or eternally in the middle, you can rise up, and there's opportunities in that. You can build your way up and become. You can climb the top of the greasy pole, as they call it, if you're capable enough. Now, I want to overdo that. There are still again slavery, women can't vote, all other sorts of things. But for white males, anyway, and even not all of those, as you see, not with the first 30 years old, they're probably not all white males can vote. That'll change in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and true democracy comes for white men later on. But there's this definite tendency toward that, and this is, by the way, contrary to many of the founders' expectations, especially the people who came to Federalists, Washington, Adams, Hamilton. They didn't like democracy at all. And they hoped John Adams was great. Like, I love John Adams. He was so naive. He thought the United States would be ruled kind of like old colonial New England was, by notable families. And in fact, they still have, like his son, John Quincy Adams, becomes president after him. You still have notable families playing a role, but it's nothing like they envisioned. Because what's going to happen is that the momentum, politically, culturally, socially, of the revolution is going to sort of get rid of all that. This will culminate in Jacksonian, populism. This is the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 30s. We'll get to that. But this is kind of what's being all worked out in this early period. This is what the text will bring to you here. So yeah, have some fun with this. Again, read as much as this as you can of Joyce Appleby. It's, again, interesting book. Again, I don't agree with everything. I don't agree. Again, when I give you something, by the way, don't expect that I agree with everything in it. But it's interesting, and I like it as an introduction for you guys. It's easy enough to read, even though there's a lot. It's not really. She's not making a really sharp and clear argument. She really is. It's really an interesting book to have to read, to learn about the period. So that is all for our introduction for this week. Again, hope you guys are having a good enough summer. Again, some of you have been email me about problems you're having. That's good. I'll try to respond to you as quickly as I can. One thing I want to remind you all, listen to this, I should post another announcement. Get your questions in as soon as possible when you post them for the discussion fora, so everybody can have a chance to respond, because some people, if you wait till Sunday night at 11 p.m., people are going to be in bed by that time. People might be doing other things. So try to get in as soon as you can. I know it's a lot of reading, especially this week. So again, apologize if that would be interesting for you with the book by Joyce Appleby. That's all for this for now. I hope you guys have a great week. Take care. See you next time.